Well, hi everyone. Welcome to another class, another day, another class. Um, I hope that everyone is doing well and that your classes are going well. We're nearing the time of Thanksgiving, holiday season. No, I mean, I guess we're more nearing Halloween, but whenever the leaves start changing, I just start thinking about Thanksgiving because we get a break and then we come back for a little bit of time and then we have a big break. So, anyways, if you are feeling discouraged, I'm saying this because I have felt discouraged in school. It's a weird time with everything being online and stuff, but we're nearing the holiday season and it will be fun and it will be awesome, and school is important, but it is not everything. So, anyways, you probably know that, but always a good reminder. Also, I'm excited because I'm going to try and show you. I hope you can see that, outside my window there are beautiful trees changing colors. So it's amazing. So I'm just looking out and having a good time. Yeah, so anyways, today we're just going to touch briefly on Barkley since we didn't really get to go over him together. And then we're going to jump into personal identity. So, I guess I should say thank you for turning in your papers. I'm working on getting those graded. It will obviously take more time than grading the response papers, and I have those to do as well. So, you probably won't, well, you won't get them back this week, but hopefully next week. So yeah. And then, I don't know, eventually you'll have your next paper, but we have a little bit of time till then. So, yeah, so we'll just kind of rewind back to Barkley, if you remember. I'm just going to kind of talk about him, give the basics. So, Barkley was born in 1685 and died in 1753. So he is from the modern era as well as Descartes was from the modern era. And Barkley wrote kind of after Descartes in response to Descartes, which is a very common thing to do in this time period. In most time periods, is to for there to be maybe one or two pieces of philosophy that really blew up, and then a lot of things to be a response to that. We'll see that in personal identity with John Locke. But Barkley, he was a bishop, so he was a Christian philosopher, and his philosophy was thoroughly influenced by his religion. So just like Descartes was influenced by his Catholic religion, Barkley was also influenced by his religion. But as you can see, though they believed probably in most of the same basics, they end up at really different conclusions when it comes to the mind-body problem. So, Barkley was concerned with splitting up the world into two separate substances because of the problem where if you have an independent substance of body, then that means that God isn't in control or isn't sovereign over the body because it's independent. So to sidestep that problem, he says that everything is immaterial. So whenever I look out and I see the awesome, beautiful, orange turning trees, the tree that I'm looking at is not actually in existence. And what's so interesting, and this is why I love Barkley, is he says that this view is the common sense view. That for the common person, this is the view that makes the most sense, which is extremely counterintuitive because if I look out and I see a tree, I expect, I would think that tree is there. I think that most people would think that tree is there. But, so it's kind of funny in a way, but also he makes an argument that for me to believe that tree exists, I have to believe something in addition to my perception. So if I'm just perceiving that tree, he doesn't argue that you're having that perception, that he's fine with that. The perception is there that there's a tree. But if you're Descartes, you have to make the extra step to think that I have this perception and also that tree is its own thing. So Berkeley is kind of making it even more simple and saying it's just the perception. So I have a perception of this pen, I have a perception of this water bottle, I have a perception of this marker, and all of those perceptions are real because I'm actually having that cognitive experience, but that cognitive experience does not prove in any way that each thing that I am having a perception of actually exists. And by that he means like it exists in your mind, but it doesn't exist in the world as material. So it's not to say that so you could believe this and have a really average experience of the world. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be like, ooh, nothing's real and I'm not going to pick up this pen because it's not real and stuff like that. Because it doesn't actually change your experience much to think that only perception exists. Because whether this pen is really material or not, I'm still going to pick it up. I'm still going to write with it. I'm still going to use it the same way that I would if it was truly material. So that's kind of like whenever you first hear about this theory, it sounds shocking and super weird. And it is a little weird, but it's not going to change your average experience if you accept it. Most people don't accept it these days, but I think it's interesting. I like it. So yeah. So this is called immaterialism, or it's also called idealism. So everything is an idea. And in this way, everything that we perceive is either our idea, or he ends up getting to the place where he says that everything that exists is a thought in the mind of God. So that's how he explains that we have all these experiences. Because if I look at this pen and really see that it looks red and white, and somebody else looks at it and says, no, it looks like green and white, and we're both like at the same distance, holding it with our hands, you might say for Berkeley that neither one is right because it's just perception. But with this understanding that everything is an idea in the mind of God, there actually ends up being a right perception, because either God sees this as red and white, or he sees it as green and white, or whatever. Maybe we're both wrong. So God is kind of what accounts for the stability in the world. And this is one reason why Berkeley didn't like Descartes' view, because he felt that you could almost have a dualistic view, or you could have a dualistic view without having God in the picture at all. So Berkeley's understanding and theory makes God big. That was one of his goals for his theory, was that God needs to be big in this. And for him, if God doesn't exist, then literally nothing works. Because God also accounts for the problem of things existing while you're not looking at them. So say I'm the only person in this room, which I am, and I put this pen, I don't know, over there. I'm not looking at the pen right now. I'm looking right here. So if nothing is perceiving that pen, then the pen doesn't exist at all, right? Because perception is what exists. There isn't a material substance in and of itself. So if there's no one perceiving that pen, then it's not there. So is the pen there right now? that's something to think about. Most people would think, yes, the pin is there. But why? What makes the pin stay there? For Berkeley, this is a big question, because until he explains God as being the ultimate perceiver, he doesn't have an answer to this. And he kind of lays out his philosophy, in points. And God being the ultimate perceiver is kind of towards the end. So you have this big problem in the middle of, okay, like the pin doesn't exist then. And that seems counterintuitive because, I don't know, we think that things exist. It's like the age-old question of if a tree falls in the forest and nobody... Is that what it is? If a tree falls in the forest and nobody is there to hear it, does it make a sound? Initially, reading Berkeley, you might say, no, it doesn't make a sound because there's no one there to perceive it. But if you read Berkeley to the end, you see, yes, it makes a sound because God is there to perceive it, and God is the ultimate perceiver. So this pin stayed in existence while it was out of my perception because God is perceiving it at all times. So it's so interesting because everything that exists that maintains persistence of identity, which we'll talk about identity in a minute, everything that maintains identity only does so because God is perceiving it. So this really makes much of God's omnipotence and omniscience, that he is able to look or see or perceive, probably not with like two physical eyes, I don't know, at all times, every single thing. So every single piece of grass in my yard, God is perceiving, or it wouldn't be there at all. Because I can't see every piece of grass, so it could be the case that the grass I can't see, okay, no one else is looking at it either, so it's not being perceived, so it doesn't exist. But, according to Berkeley, we have a God that is looking at that grass, perceiving that grass, and that is why it is there all the time. So, super fascinating theory because it's so counterintuitive. And you probably somewhere in your education you've learned of dualism in some case, separation between mind and body. But maybe, my assumption is that you don't hear about there only being mind. And that the only mind, it's that there are three things that exist for Berkeley. Two things. Well, it's kind of three. It's hard, but it's God, and then, so God and God's mind would kind of be the same than like our minds, but those are, they're both minds, but one is God, so it's kind of, distinct. And then thoughts. So minds and their thoughts are the only things that exist. Berkeley is one of my favorite philosophers simply because it's so radical, and this is not something that you'll ever hear in like probably a science class or something like that because it sounds outrageous. But if you think about it, it can be more compelling than it might seem on its surface. Because it doesn't change your everyday experience. You can hold this view and live a life like somebody who believes in material things. I'm not trying to convince you to believe it. I figure most people don't. I don't want there to be this idea that like, oh, that's just way too crazy. He was an idiot. I can't believe he ever thought that. Because, there are reasons to believe this, whether you accept it or not. Like I said, most people don't. But it's always important to give the philosophers kind of the benefit of the doubt or a charitable reading. So, try and think through, try and be where he is, and see, okay, I could maybe see how he would come to that conclusion. So it's actually interesting because I'll be writing my thesis over Jonathan Edwards, who was a later philosopher theologian, slightly later. He was in the 1700s, but he kind of has the same idea of immaterialism, but it sounds less radical because it's coupled with a bunch of theology kind of explaining it. Anyways, so Berkeley was not the only one to believe this, and he won't be. I think that this is something that even with modern science, like, science can't disprove this, because you can maintain that, like, okay, water is H2O. That doesn't mean that water is material. Even though it might seem that way because, okay, we have the chemical compound for what water is, he would just say that all of these perceptions that we're having are still real. They just don't mean material. So, yeah. Super cool. Super weird, but interesting nonetheless. So, that's kind of just my brief overview of who Berkeley is. I'm a big fan just because he's pretty crazy. Most people, like I said, most people don't believe this, but it's so cool. You should at least know about it. Yeah, so then we also have Spinoza after Berkeley, that was a Jewish philosopher. And he argued for a similar thing, but instead of everything being a thought, I've said this before, instead of everything being a thought, everything is God. Everything is an extension of God. Berkeley is not saying that. That would be a pantheistic view of everything that exists being God. Berkeley would just say everything that exists is a thought in the mind of God. So those are two different things, but similar in like how radically different they are from what we would typically think. So I think that's a good enough little overview. If you're interested, I like Berkeley, so I'll always talk about him. Yeah, so now we will kind of move on. So think of Descartes and Berkeley, just to sum up, both rationalists, both thinking that knowledge is gained a priori, meaning you can gain knowledge before having experience. That's not true. Descartes is a rationalist. Berkeley is actually an empiricist, because you get to the conclusion that everything is perception from perceiving. So he's actually more in line with Hume in that regard, which is also interesting because he comes to a drastically different conclusion than Hume. Hume is saying that everything is material, and Berkeley is saying that nothing is material, and both of them are using the same basis for how to get knowledge, which is through experience. So looking at two philosophers from the same time period and kind of comparing and contrasting them in your mind, I think is a really good way to learn and keep track of what's happening and what they're thinking. Yeah, especially in the modern period, just because there's a few big names and they all kind of go together and play off of each other and, respond to each other. So it's all good stuff. Okay, I think that's enough to sum up Descartes and Berkeley. If you can't tell, the modern period is one of my favorites. I think I've already said that, but modern and medieval, I think, are so fascinating because they're so, like, there are themes in there that are so embedded into the time period that every philosopher in the time period touches on the same stuff in totally different ways. That's what's so interesting. You can have like the same pieces in your philosophy and they come out drastically different. So anyways, I like that stuff. And we're going to talk about Locke, who's also part of the modern period, but he was kind of towards the end. So he kind of switches stuff up a little bit on us, but still interesting. So we're going to dive into personal identity. And what we mean by personal identity is the answer to certain questions. So here are some questions that personal identity, the heading, tries to answer. So, one being, what sorts of changes can we undergo and survive? Oh gosh, this isn't good. Good thing you can't read it anyways. So an example of this, what sorts of changes can we undergo and survive, would be, okay, I got in a huge car accident, and like I don't know how this works, so forgive me if this actually never happens at all. I get all new skin, and none of it's my own skin. They do a skin transplant. I think that's a real thing. I'm unsure. And maybe I get a heart transplant, and I get a brain transplant. So most things that you would consider to be essential to who someone is, those things were changed. Am I still the same person or not? Which change? Am I the same person until I change the heart? Am I the same person until I change the brain? Am I the same person no matter what? Those are important questions that personal identity seeks to answer. Then the next question is, can we survive the destruction of our bodies? So, I mean, that's kind of similar to my example I just used, but imagine like every part of me was demolished, but somehow I was still, well, yeah, suppose my whole body died, and then they put my brain and they make it better, and they put it in someone else's body. Is that me? It's another question. And if we don't survive the destruction of our bodies, does it matter? And does it matter is one of the most important questions, because we can seek to answer all these questions, and you can develop really interesting, weird theories, but does it matter? Does it have any effect? If it does, what is the effect? Why does it matter? All important. So, the book talks about personal identity as a special case of a more general topic, which is the survival or persistence of objects over time. So, we can write that. The persistence of objects over time. So this would be kind of a general definition of identity. We'll dive into specifically personal identity, so it'll be the persistence of self over time. Now, it kind of goes through a few different examples to think about. It talks about a house being destroyed in a flood. So, or burning down, I guess it has two different ones. But imagine your house burns down, and then you build like the same exact house in its place. Is that the same house? No, because we're talking about the numerical sense of identity. And there are two houses going on, the one before the burning and then a new one after the burning. So those are two separate houses. Because there are two things can't be identical. So they're not the same house. Even though it was pretty much the same, it would be like a twin, like an identical twin. There's two of them still. Even though they look the exact same, they're still two separate people. So they're not, in the strict sense, identical. They're not the exact same thing. It gives the example of when things are the same. So 3 squared equals 9. So 3 squared and 9 are the exact same thing. Numerically, they are the same. They are not two things. They are both 9. Or they are both 3 squared. They're just the same thing. So survival should be defined in terms of strict or numerical identity. So that kind of helps us narrow down what is what and what maintains identity over time. So there's this one famous case of a ship. And actually, I wonder if we're going to read that. Let me check real quick. Okay, it doesn't look like it. All right, so there's this famous case about a ship. And so I'm just going to set it up for you. Imagine a ship, and one of the boards is looking old, and it's kind of starting to decay. So you change out that board. At that point, the ship before the new board and the ship after the new board, most of us would consider to be the same. So say there's another board that starts to decay, so you replace that one. Still thinking, okay, it's the same ship. Maybe 5 boards. Okay, still seems like the same ship, probably. Maybe you have a different intuition, but I think most people would say, yeah, it still seems like the same ship. Then maybe you get 20 boards. Okay, it's starting to seem like, okay, maybe it's changing, but it still seems like it's the same ship. Then you get to 50 boards. I don't know how many boards are in a ship, so this analogy is going to fail eventually. And it's like, okay, 50, but still the integrity of the ship is still intact. We're still good, still same ship. You keep going, and at what point does the ship become not the old ship? Because at some point, all the boards will be replaced, and it's not the same ship. But where does that shift take place? Because you probably can't point to, okay, when it's 100 boards, it's a different ship. So it's just an interesting question. It's more of a story to make you think than it is to answer any questions. But just to make you think, what makes an object persist over time as the same object? Maybe you could think of like a mechanical pencil. It has lead in it, but eventually this lead will run out. It will get new lead or replace the eraser. Is it still the same pencil? That is something to think about. So these are all questions that fall under the realm of identity in philosophy. Yep. So they give the example of a house, kind of like the ship. Well, they kind of do a little bit of a different one. But imagine that you lived in this house for forever, and it's been in your family for hundreds of years, and it's been replaced over the years, maybe over 50 years. Repaired. And so everything by now has been completely replaced. Is that the same house, even though it happened over time? You could say yes, you could say no. It's up to you. But something to think about. So we can talk about objects all day long, but we're going to move on to you or me, ourselves, personal identity. So, because if I look at myself, it seems that I have been the same self my whole life. So imagine, but like whenever you think specifically, it may seem more difficult to see that. So if I think about when I was 18 years old and I was going away for college and I was young, I was dumb, probably still both of those things. This will work whenever I'm older. But it, like, whenever I think of like packing the car and going to college for the first time, like it seems like that was me, but it seems like a totally different version of myself. And even you, like, you could think about, I don't know, maybe it was just a couple years ago that felt so different. Or maybe it was going to middle school for the first time and you're like, that was a completely different person. And a lot of things about myself have changed in 6 years or so. Almost 7. And even though I have that feeling of like, that really feels like a totally different person, I still maintain that, okay, it was the same person, but it does feel different. So what accounts for that? What accounts for me thinking that I am the same person that I was when I was 18? So we need to think about what constitutes personal identity. What is personal identity? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions? So you have a few different theories. The first one that we will touch on is the physical appearance criterion. Physical appearance. So that is an option for what accounts for your maintaining yourself over time. They, in the book, the authors don't give much time for this one because they just kind of say it's obviously wrong. Because, well, there's like a dozen different reasons that this isn't a great theory. One is that you could look the exact same as someone, say you have an identical twin, and y'all are not the same. Y'all are not the same self. Y'all are two different selves. So that disproves it. Another thing is that I looked a lot different when I was 10 years old than I do right now. I don't look the exact same. So in that case, I would have to be a different person. Or, to make it more extreme, say you get cosmetic surgery, and you actually don't look at all like you used to. Like, I mean, I still favor how I looked when I was 10. In that case, using this theory, you would not be the same person at all. And that seems untrue. So, not much time to that one. That one's not so good. Then you get the soul criterion. So, your physical appearance can change, a bunch of things can change, but as long as your soul remains, then you are the same person. So whenever I was 11, I had the same soul that I have right now, so I am the same person. This can be, John Locke actually argues against this by saying that his is kind of a weird way to argue against it. But he says, like, the same soul that was in Socrates could have been in, I don't know, he gives a few different examples, in Plato or something. So I could have the same soul as someone who lived long time ago, but it was just wiped of all memory and then placed inside me. So that's why I don't recall anything. So then the soul wouldn't really mean anything for maintaining personal identity because I'm not the same person that the soul that's inside me was. It's kind of obscure because I don't know that we typically think of souls as being in different bodies. People used to, like Plato used to think that, but it's not a super common idea these days. But that's still an argument against it. So Then another option is the brain criterion. That, okay, you don't have to have the same soul or the same physical appearance, but you do need to have the same brain. So say that my whole body disintegrated and all I had was my brain, I would still be the same person. But this doesn't quite solve any problems, because say that let's see. Okay, imagine that you have a brain disease that will destroy all your brain cells. And then medical technology has advanced to the point where we can gradually replace each brain cell with a prosthetic artificial cell. At the end of the process, your brain is completely gone, replaced by a prosthetic brain. If the artificial cells are sufficiently good, wouldn't you still be around? But if you can survive the loss of the original brain, then the brain criterion is incorrect. So, I mean, one thing that philosophy does a lot is come up with obscure examples or counterexamples to disprove things. And they may sound obscure, but if you're able to disprove something by saying, okay, well, what if this happened? A lot of times that's a good argument. So, it's kind of interesting, but it's a weird way to do things. But if you can come up with a counterexample, that's great. So that's kind of what that is, just a counterexample. All right. So then we get Locke, who is distinctly different from all these, which most people before him fell into one of those categories. Most people in the modern period falling into the soul category. Hume would be more like the brain. All right, so Locke's theory of identity was based on psychological connections, which is similar to memory. So, in essence, psychological connections provided by memory, you could say. So this is the memory criterion. I will write it out. Or memory criterion. Okay. So A, who exists at T1 equals B, who exists, we're running out of room, who exists at T2 if and only if B can remember at T2 some experiences of A at T1. Okay. So, A, who exists at T1, equals B, who exists at T2, if and only if B can remember at T2 some of the experiences of A at T1. Okay, so what this would mean, it's kind of complicated, I think, to use letters instead of just names. So, say, okay, I'll use myself as an example. Hopefully this will work. Okay. Holly, who exists at a certain time, is the same as, well, oh, this is good. Okay. Child Holly, who exists at a certain time, is the is equivalent to adult Holly, who exists at a different time, if and only if adult Holly can remember at the second period of time the experiences of child Holly at the first set of time. Okay, I hope that helped. Okay, maybe we could... How about this? Child Holly, who exists at from 1996 to 2014, is the same as adult Holly, who exists at 2014 to 2020, if and only if adult Holly can remember from 2014 to 2020 some of the experiences of child Holly from 1996 to 2014. Okay. I hope that helps. So basically, if I got in a car wreck and all of my memory was erased, I wouldn't necessarily be the same person, which is very controversial, because we would think, yes, you are, you're still you. But we need a theory to account for that, and Locke's just doesn't really. It kind of does. He's kind of confusing. So, this paper from Locke is like the most famous paper on personal identity. It's like one of the first major papers on it. And so everything written after is kind of a response to it. So you would think, oh, it's like really, really awesome. And it is good. It's just, I would expect it to be more clear than it is. It's actually, like, we still don't fully know what he's saying in some parts. So, which is partly why there's so much written after it, is to account for those things that are unclear. So, but yeah. So, I'm kind of just going to try to summarize Locke the best I can, because the reading is kind of dense, and for me, if I can understand the main idea, then it helps me understand the reading altogether. So I'm going to try and give the main idea the best I can. So the main idea is in the psychological connection over time. So he's arguing against the soul theory, because there could be a different soul put in you or something like that. But he's arguing for this psychological consciousness thing. So he says the same consciousness. Let's see. Okay. Let me try to explain this very simply. Okay. For it is, I'm just going to read it actually, and then I'll explain it. For it is by the consciousness it has of its present thoughts and actions that it is self to itself now, and so will be the same self as far as the same consciousness can extend to actions past or to come, and would be by distance of time or change of substance no more two persons than a man be two men by wearing other clothes today than he did yesterday, with a long or short sleep between. The same consciousness uniting those distant actions into the same person, whatever substance contributed to their production. So there's a same consciousness uniting who I was yesterday wearing different clothes to who I am today wearing different clothes. Just because I look different or because I'm doing something different doesn't make a difference, because I still have the same consciousness. So one thing that he says that's interesting is that this is in section 19. He says, this may show us wherein personal identity consists, not in the identity of substance, but as I've said, in the identity of consciousness. wherein if Socrates and the present mayor of Kinborough agree, they are the same person. If the same Socrates waking and sleeping do not partake of the same consciousness, Socrates waking and sleeping is not the same person. So if I somehow adopt a different consciousness in my sleep than I do when I'm awake, those are two totally different people with different identities. What's unclear about this is what would account for a completely different consciousness. But I mean, this does show that after you have amnesia or something, like, you would be a different person because it seems that you have a different consciousness if you don't remember anything that happened to you before, which you might think is probably a flaw in Locke's theory. So the simplest way to define Locke's theory of personal identity is come on. All right. The identity of a person across time depends on extending consciousness backwards in time. Oh, that's not good. In time. Okay. The identity of a person across time depends on extending consciousness backwards in time. So it's very dependent on time, which is why memory is so important for this theory. So I am the same person as I was as a child because I can remember having the same consciousness as a child as I do now. It's vague, but it is unique and novel. So that's why it has persisted. This theory has kind of stood the test of time in a sense. People don't believe exactly what he was saying, but the principle remains that consciousness is important to identity. Okay, so I think I might actually stop there because we'll want to say a little bit more about Locke before diving into Swinburne next time. So I'll kind of save some of Locke for next time. And since we covered a lot of ground with Berkeley and everything, we'll just call it a day. Yeah, so if you have any questions, please reach out to me. I hope everybody turned in their papers. If you didn't, just email it to me. I just had the link up for when it was due just because I wanted to make sure I kept track of what was on time and what wasn't, and it's easier to do that if the late ones are just sent to me. And if I give you, an extension or something, that's fine too. Just email it to me, and I will be working on those and hopefully get them out in a reasonable timely manner. I hope everyone is doing well. Oh, I forgot to introduce Locke. He's also from the modern time period. He was born in 1632 to 1704, and he is British, or was British, I should say. And most people that aren't, that don't do philosophy know him from politics. So he heavily influenced the founding fathers of America, specifically Thomas Jefferson. So you have probably heard the name before, and you've probably read something about his view of government, maybe in history, English, or government class or something. So, sorry, forgot to say that. Okay, I will see you guys later.